Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 29th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussant tonight is David Green. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everyone is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, and then having our colleague comment on them. Today is July 18th, in the second week of an Israeli assault on the almost 2 million people living in the 140 square miles of the reservation, the open-air prison, called Gaza. It's the second day of an Israeli ground invasion. Amidst the remarkable disinformation we're receiving through the U.S. media, we should ask who is responsible for the Israeli military assault on Gaza. Obviously, many people can be blamed for Israel's committing what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime, launching aggressive war. But the final responsibility lies with the President of the United States. Barack Obama is chiefly responsible for the dead people in Gaza. Without the support, economic, military, political, and diplomatic, that the U.S. government provides, Israel's crimes would not be possible. But the U.S. does not provide this support because of undue influence from the government of Israel or the Israel lobby. The U.S. government supports Israel and its oppression of the Palestinians because Israel is America's stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East. Most Americans think of the U.S. war in the Middle East as beginning after 9/11, 2001, with the American invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. But in fact, our government has been killing people in the Mideast since the Second World War to secure control of what the U.S. State Department then called the world's greatest material prize, Mideast gas and oil. The U.S. government demands not just access to Mideast energy resources, but control of them, because a stranglehold over world energy flows gives the U.S. the advantage over its economic rivals in Europe and Asia, notably Germany and China. Obama fails to stop the killing, as he could with a word, because it's been the policy of all U.S. administrations for 2 generations to allow the Israelis to continue their oppression of the Palestinians so long as Israel supports and participates in the crimes of its U.S. master. Obama established his reputation as a child killer with the drone program. 200 children among the 5,000 people he's killed with drones. Now he extends that reputation with 260 dead in Gaza, including 50 children. Kids playing on the beach, deliberately targeted, has produced a peculiar fillip in American news coverage where the mainstream news reporter has been removed from the job because he was telling too much truth. You're watching News from Neptune, another child killer edition. And we'll begin by taking up a piece that David wrote for the local daily last Sunday. David, I don't know if you'd be willing to try to give a précis of what that was.
Sure,
It was David. David is the leading unpaid columnist for the News Gazette, and his pieces are frequently the most valuable thing you'll find in the Daily Fish Wrap. So,
there was actually I wrote a piece that included a reference to the now well-known work of Thomas Piketty called Capital in 21st Century. They actually had a whole article. I think it was a nice combination that Dan Corkery, the managing editor who arranges the Sunday commentary section, to put my article next to another article that was continued on the same page from the front page, talking about the publication of Thomas Piketty's book and what the implications were. And so I thought, if you don't mind my saying so, a rare opportunity to be informed from the Sunday commentary section at a slightly more insightful level than is usual, which I suppose is not saying much. But nevertheless, writing this little piece was a fairly mechanical exercise, given how much press the Piketty book has gotten, as well as at least one political science article hasn't got it in as much attention in the mainstream press. But it's well known that a couple of political scientists named Gillens and Page, one of whom is at Northwestern, have published an article in which they gathered 2,000, a database of 2,000 instances of legislation in Congress to try to make the argument as to what sort of theory explains what legislation gets passed. And of course, the conclusion isn't surprising to anyone who's coming from a sort of Chomskyan perspective of the world. The researcher that Chomsky often refers to in the slide is a guy named Thomas Ferguson, who has something called investment theory of politics. It all ends up in the same place, in which money buys candidates, and then legislation is a result of wealthy interest groups and lobbyists' effect on the process in Congress. We didn't necessarily need an elaborate database, which took an enormous amount of work to build, but there it is, and they've proved it, and they have published their article. I'm not sure if it's officially out yet in the Political Science Journal or American Journal of Political Science. You can go online and find it. If you just Google Gillens, Gillens, and Page, and something about political theory, and it shows that that money gets its way. I've mentioned previously on a program that there's another much longer article out, although it's really not as long as it looks because it's got a lot of footnotes about what's called double government, what a 19th century British theorist called double government, and how that affects foreign policy in particular, and an argument by a political theorist regarding what he calls the Trumanite system in this country, in which, in spite of what Carl might have just said about Obama's responsibility, and maybe this is what we're talking about, that even the president doesn't have a whole lot of control over foreign policy, and there's an argument to be made for that there is a kind of a deep sort of shadow foreign policy government, mainly the Pentagon, but also all of the agencies that you hear about, which doesn't necessarily even give the president a whole lot of choice. I wouldn't quite let him off the hook that easily. Easily so. So it's worth talking about.
I'd like to take up that point, and it seems to me that's interesting in a number of ways. I think the way to look at it is to see that there's no debate between presidential activities and the executive branch, the bureaucracy, the administration in the largest sense, including also the Pentagon, the CIA, and so forth. Because after all, that's not the president's job. The president's job is to be a PR man, to deal with the only real enemy that the American government, working as it does primarily for the 1%, the only real enemy that government has is the American populace. And the president's job is to make nice with the American populace, to make sure that the anger that we see growing in the American society, and that leads everything from the Department of Homeland Security to buy bullets, to police forces to put together regional associations to deal with possible uprisings in the American populace. The president's job is to cozen the commons, and to make sure that there is not a major outbreak of objection in a long-running depression and a foreign an immensely expensive foreign adventure. That's his job. So the idea that somehow the president is prevented from doing all those good things he'd like to do, I think is a mistake. He talks about those good things he'd like to do because he has to convince the populace that the government is on their side. And he has to explain that, well, of course, it's the opposition that he gets from everything from the Tea Party to other Republicans that prevents him from doing all those good things. This is all play acting. And it's not a question of a reformist president suddenly being stopped by the bureaucracy.
Yeah. Well, you would think after 5.5 years that act would be getting a little bit thin, and not only that, as it kicked in. I mean, what the Z website did yesterday was to put up an interview with Noam Chomsky from the first week of Obama's first term, at the end, during which Israel was cleaning up, was finishing Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. So without comment, they simply posted this interview that Amy Goodman did with Noam Chomsky, saying exactly the same things that he's saying right now regarding the nature of that and what Obama, how Obama, chose, and it was already determined during the interim period when Obama was president in waiting. He famously said that we only have one president, so he wasn't going to comment on the Gaza situation that was going on at that time. So now he is the president. He is the president, and it is his job. And of course, he's doing exactly the same thing that George Bush was doing 5.5 years ago during December and January of 2008 and 2009, in regarding to basically allowing Israel, maybe not necessarily encouraging Israel, but certainly allowing Israel to do what it does, when in fact the president, at some level, as you're saying, in spite of the fact that he's precisely been vetted to allow Israel to do these things, not because of the Israel lobby, and nothing has changed because Chuck Hagel is now Secretary of Defense. That these things will continue in the same vein. It's just that Obama has sort of added this sort of cachet of being the first black president and having the support, apparently undying support of segments of the sort of African American democratic political establishment that seem to make it even more difficult to get the idea through that he does not represent the interests of the bulk of African American people or the bulk of working families in this country.
Your lead for your article was the sentence, "Over the past 4 decades, our democracy has increasingly become one in name and electoral process only." That's right, and that's what needs to be said.
Sure.
The idea that there is an alteration from administration to administration in the basic policy issues, both domestic and foreign, I might say, is simply false. American government policy, organized particularly in those 40 years that you referred to at the behest of the 1% of the tiny American economic elite, that policy remains consistent from administration to administration, even if the names on the door change, or even if the party labels change, even if we move from Reagan to Clinton, for example. And I thought the best example, or the best sort of explanation of that, in some sense, comes not from an American source, but from a British source. Everyone admits that there was a major public change in direction in British politics around 1980. In other words, that's your 40-year mark, with the arrival of Prime Minister Thatcher in Britain. And it paralleled, of course, the arrival of the Reagan administration in this country, which might be argued, there are problems here, that might be argued represents a change in American policy, the birth, or not the birth exactly, because it's more monstrous than that, but the success of the neoliberal campaign, the clear success of the neoliberal campaign. Mrs. Thatcher was asked towards the end of her tenure, or after she had left office, rather, she was asked what her greatest accomplishment was, and she thought for a minute and said, "New labor." The answer being that the formation, the transformation of the formerly Social Democratic Party, Labour in Britain, into a party that looked very much like Mrs. Thatcher's party in terms of its politics, both at home and abroad. That is the rise of Tony Blair. That she saw as her accomplishment. Well, if transport that to an American context, in some ways, Ronald Reagan's greatest accomplishment was Bill Clinton. Because the Clinton policies,
New Democrats,
the New Democrats,
Democratic Leadership Council, or whatever,
exactly,
whatever he represents, yeah.
And that this took over from the old New Deal tradition, which was still around. I mean, the New Deal was, as Piketty points out in his book, that there was a real change in American politics, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, really, as a result of the Great Depression and the Second World War. And the New Deal tradition continued on in the Democratic Party through the Johnson administration, certainly. And you got to the point that the tradition had to be jettisoned for the Democratic Party to take on the neoliberal contour. And when it did that, it did it as the heirs of Republican neoliberalism. We got our choice between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, where before there had at least been, in theory, a distinction.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of going to dive into some of the things I talked about in this article in relation to Piketty, and I guess the most basic thing to say is that the recognition that the book has gotten is deserved because of the data he gathered and the argument that he makes about increasing disparities in wealth that date to the 1970s, and that bring those disparities in wealth back to a position that hadn't been achieved since late in the 19th century, which had been minimized in a historically unique way after World War II between 1945 and about 1975. Where Piketty has created controversy and debate, and very constructive debate, I think, on the left, and I mean from the liberal left and the Keynesian left to the Marxist and sort of neo-Marxist left, is in the political remedies that he prescribes for dealing with these disparities in wealth that have become so ingrained and promise only to get larger because of the nature of capitalism itself, which he talks about in this book, about how the manner in which the people who have money and have capital invest that money gains greater returns than income can grow. Even if productivity does grow, income doesn't grow of people who live from hand to mouth, so to speak, just can't grow fast enough to keep up with the gains in wealth of those who already have some money in the stock market or real estate or other aspects of our economy. So it really comes down to this, and the premise of the article, I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward, is that you need more than for Thomas Piketty to propose a global wealth tax. A global wealth tax would be a wonderful thing, but you need, that's a governmental reform, and there are many people on the Keynesian left proposing all kinds of things that would bring us towards more full employment, greater demand, lessen some of the disparities, raise wages, bring American manufacturing back by lowering the value of the dollar and therefore lowering the trade deficit, work sharing where people would work shorter weeks and therefore there would be more jobs and more pressure on the labor market to raise wages. All of these things are good practical suggestions, as is a global wealth tax or even a national wealth tax, however politically impossible that might seem. But the question, even beyond the feasibility or non-feasibility of those things, is what is the position that we find ourselves in? And I think this is being asked on the sort of on the more left, the more Marxist left. What kind of position do we find ourselves in? Does the working class, broadly speaking, find itself in relation to power? And how do you challenge beyond political programs, beyond governmental programs, or beyond electoral politics, or beyond particular remedies? How do you challenge the entire structure of what's going on? And I think the last big work I mentioned, my article that I've mentioned before in the program, is Leo Panich and Sam Ginden's work, The Making of Global Capitalism. And it's an arduous work, and you can read articles about it that I think explain it pretty well, but there's no way to get around the fact that it's challenging. But there's no way for us to get around the fact that we need, if we want to understand what it is to be done, then we need to challenge ourselves in understanding how the system works and engaging the debate about how the system works and what might be done about it. And so I would just add to that I think the implications of neoliberalism, the financialization of the economy, which is a broad concept and is a complicated concept as it's being interpreted, but it's integral to understanding what neoliberalism is. Yeah. In understanding what all that means is that the term public provision, the area in which public provision happens in our society and in the developed countries as a whole and in the world as a whole, has become narrower and narrower. And so there's really no way around politically to understand that what needs to be struggled for is an expansion, is a radical expansion in the public provision. And I think one can talk about this in various ways in terms of education, in terms of health care, in terms of retirement, in terms of pensions. All of these things have been privatized and create to a financialized economy in which people find themselves increasingly in debt and are therefore wedded to this financialized economy in ways that ultimately people feel like they have to be their own capitalist. They have to build up their own nest egg throughout their life to retire with, whether in terms of their IRA, their home, or whatever other savings they have, when in fact we could have a much broader Social Security system which takes the heat off people as they approach retirement and gives them more choices, and then sort of ipso facto gives them more choices in terms of home ownership versus renting throughout their lives, gives them more choices in education and how they pay for it, and even would give them more choices. I think the fourth category that's important to talk about there is public housing, which very consciously was given a bad name in this country, was racialized in this country in urban areas and given a bad name because of the way it was done, not because it isn't affordable or feasible, not that we couldn't have middle-class broad middle-class public housing in this country, which could be a choice that people would make given broader public provision on any number of fronts. And so this is what I think that the working classes and working class movements, broader than the labor movement itself, have to be talking about right now. And I think this is where the work of Panich and Gindin and all this other work that leads us to ask what to do about inequality and what to do about the erosion of democratic participation. This is what people can organize around. This is what people can understand. This is what people can do something about. And I think in all those areas that I mentioned, housing, healthcare, education, and pensions, there are movements in these areas. There are growing movements in these areas, and they need to be connected to each other. And of course they are. I mean, the people that are in these movements well understand, that they're making choices of where to devote their energy to. But still, I think it needs to be more broadly understood in, say, the framework of the Green Party or some other political, unnamed political movement, that these things need to be joined and pursued in a very conscientious way.
And it needs to be articulated politically. We need a public discussion of these things that is not going to come from the traditional parties in any way. People know what their own situation is. People could look over recent years, particularly since the 2007-2009 financial crisis. In other words, the beginnings of the current Great Recession. They can look at their own circumstances and know how difficult they are. But we don't have a language, we don't have a discourse for the discussion of why that's a social artifact, why that's a result of the policies followed by the government at the behest of the 1%. And we need to get that discussion going. The task of our political parties is to establish limits of allowable debate that get those questions out, that put those questions away. Hey, they're pretty good at it. It gets done fairly well. We're not having a discussion about a wealth tax in this country because that's outside the limits of allowable debate. And that's true even, by the way, of people who are impressed with what Thomas Piketty had to say. They said, well, of course, it's never it wouldn't be possible. I mean, we never convince enough people that we need a wealth tax. It would have to be done on some sort of international basis. There's no way we could do that. It reminds me of the remark of Oscar Wilde, who, like most poets, saw things more clearly than his contemporaries, even if he expressed them sometimes peculiarly, who said socialism was a very good idea, but it would take too many evenings. In other words, there'd be too much discussion, too much attempt to put together what are in fact political movements to do this sort of thing. That seems to me right. And one of the reasons that I thought your article was particularly good is you started with the extent to which the forms of democratic discussion in this country had been confiscated along with the lifestyles of the middle class. These things are not unconnected. If you have a vigorous democracy talking about the public provision that you just outlined, David, then the 1% is going to get worried. But in fact, you may have noticed the 1% isn't very worried these days. No. The United States has the most maldistributed access to wealth of any developed country. There is greater inequality in the American economic system than in Namibia. There's greater inequality in the American system than in the leading European states. That inequality, the technical way of talking about that refers to a economist's bit of mathematics called the Gini index, named interestingly for a fascist economist at the beginning of the 20th century, but at least he got the math right. And the Gini index is an attempt to try to represent mathematically how wealth is distributed in the society. And the index runs from 0 to 1. If you have a Gini index of 0 for your society, everything is perfectly distributed. That is, every member of the society owns exactly one share, and there are as many shares as there are members of the society. Okay, if the Gini index reaches 1, one person owns everything. Now that's a fairly handy number, hey?
We're a lot closer to the latter situation.
Exactly. If you look at the numbers for the Gini index, you find that the Gini index for the United States is twice that of Japan. That is, Japan is much closer to even distribution than the United States is. In fact, the United States surpasses all other developed countries in the maldistribution of wealth and property that exists in this society. And it's getting worse. That's the second part about that, is that the 40 years of neoliberalism was not just a walk in the park for the American ascendancy. They had a program, a very real program that was a counter to what we sometimes refer to disparagingly as the 60s. The 60s was, amongst other things, a movement. The 1960s led to movements for the democratization, not just of the polity, but also the economy. Democratization of society. In other words, moves that would have made the public provision that you talked about an issue, and that would have reduced the Gini index. That had to be stopped from the point of view of those who held wealth and power in the United States, few as they happened to be. But it led to a problem. The problem was that they couldn't do it, as it were, on their own, even with all the control of wealth that they had. They needed what another economist of Gini's generation called the political class. The political class is about the 20% of the population, roughly we might say today, those who graduated from a good college. And the 1% had to convince the 20% that they were on one another's side over against the 80% of the unwashed out there, who simply wanted to be supported by the people who actually rightly enjoyed wealth. Okay, well, that's the political program is pretty clear there, but it had to be done in a way that misrepresented what was actually happening, and that's what neoliberalism was. And hey, neoliberalism won.
And I think why I'm spending over the last few months referred to this book by Panish and Gindin so much is that they're making an argument in a certain way that I mean, there are debates on the left and among Marxists and quasi-Marxists that I can't go into and probably wouldn't want to go into, but they are making some important points in this context, which is to say that in opposition to what some other Marxist type economists are supposedly saying, that neoliberalism is a highly productive system. It isn't, even if we use the term financialization, it isn't about speculation. It's about using money and using this abstract thing that we call money to rearrange the way the world works and rearrange the way productivity gets done, and most important, rearrange the way who benefits from that. So it isn't to be minimized that this neoliberal economy, in spite of its regular crises, which they talk about how they're handled, these authors talk about how they're handled, that they've learned how to handle them. That's what neoliberalism has been. They came out of the 2008 recession smelling like a rose, stronger than ever, and they've gotten all the gains that all the wealth that's accrued to the society in the last 6 or 7 years has gone to that 1% or even less. So it's a formidable system. And I think the message that Panish and Gindin want to get across is that we need to understand that this isn't going to collapse on its own. It isn't going to collapse because of crises, which they've learned to manage pretty well. that it's a productive system, that it isn't just a system, it isn't just a Ponzi scheme. It's going to take a very thoughtful understanding of how the system works in relation to both the economy and the state and the relationship, the interrelationships and embeddedness in which the economy and the state have always had in capitalism. The hardest thing to get beyond in the mainstream media is the idea that the economy is something in outer space and that the government is something separate from that. It's like separating the atmosphere from the weather. You know, we have to understand how both of those things work together. We have to understand how neoliberalism uses government, depends on the state, in order to have a political program with which to challenge that. And it's challenging. Maybe it's a little technical, but I think to conceive of the way neoliberal government works and how capitalism is on a roll, not failing, not in crisis, but on a roll, people are going to have to put their thinking caps on and get their organizing caps on the basis of what we understand. And I think whatever, I think somebody like me who tries to talk to people, whether in the context of the show or a political campaign or the articles, you get complaints about, well, do people really understand this? Can they understand this? Isn't there a simpler way to explain this? Well, yes, there are simpler ways to explain it. I mean, there's ways of boiling things down, and many of the things that are being said. And I think that Noam Chomsky is doing a good job has always done a good job. He doesn't use a lot of jargon, or really any jargon. He just describes the way the economy works. And so we have to do that, and then we have to talk to each other. We have to become unisolate. We have to challenge wherever we can this media dominance, this supply-demand approach that the mainstream media takes towards, or this meritocratic approach that somehow, well, if people have all this money, they must just be smarter and doing better and better educated and all that stuff. We just have to really go at this mythology so that people become both very cynical on the one hand and very hopeful on the other hand that things can change.
The 20th century Christian scholar, and he was quite a scholar too, by the way, C.S. Lewis, in one of his dramatic presentations of stories that originally appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, as a matter of fact, letters between a senior devil and a junior devil, has the senior devil saying, the greatest triumph of our side, the demonic side, the greatest triumph of our side in the 20th century, he says, is to convince people that we don't exist. Well, whatever you think about Lewis's arguments, neoliberalism could say precisely the same thing. Yeah. Neoliberalism, as the most successful political movement in America over the last 40 years, has part of its success has managed to convince people that it doesn't exist. The word neoliberal is not known to more than 3 of 10 of the people you'd pass on the street, and that may be an overestimate. So the real form of American politics becomes unknown and unrealized. And the first task that someone like Chomsky, who the inspiration behind the program we've done here for a long time, the first task is to talk about what's really going on. And the same thing, I'd like to make a transition here perhaps for a moment, the same thing appears in the connection between the economic domination that neoliberalism has reasserted in the United States over the last 40 years, and the economic domination that is the heart of American foreign policy. We've got a term for that too, but the terms are rarely connected. we speak of neoconservatives as a result of political discussions in the last generation and so forth in this country. And neoconservatives have mainly been those who want an aggressive and American foreign policy. They want the United States to conduct wars. The neoconservative case for the attack on Iraq was the principal part of what the Bush administration was drawing on when it set that out. Everyone knows that the Bush administration lied about why we were going to Iraq, but fewer people know about what they were covering up, what was really at stake here. And as someone pointed out, if the principal product of Iraq had been asparagus, we wouldn't have sent the American army. Now, it was clearly the fact that Iraq was the world's second largest oil producer that attracted the attention, so to speak, of the Bush administration. As part of the long-term American policy, you can call it neoconservative if you want, of controlling the worldwide economy. The U.S. was in control of the worldwide economy at the end of the Second World War, when we had about 6% of the world's population and 50% of the world's wealth. And U.S. policy ever since then has been an attempt to maintain that sort of control, maintain the disparity, as George Kennan said in the late 1940s. In your article, David, you talk about Trumanite policies, and it's worthwhile. It goes back perhaps to the issue we started the hour with, how much can presidents be blamed, so to speak, for what they're covering up.
Right.
But whether the fairly limited haberdasher from Kansas City really was responsible for the policy that goes by his name, in a sense, doesn't matter, because what he presided over was the implication of this American world hegemony for the interest, once again, of the American economic elite. And we have to see that played out, I think, in current things from Ukraine to Israel. And until we do that, we won't have a serious discussion about why our president is killing people in various parts of the world.
Yeah. Again, you have to sort of question and break down some of these dichotomies that are part of the mainstream political culture, that domestic policy is somehow separate from foreign policy. It's just in the sense that the way that the government is separate from the economy. I mean, these things are they're all mixed up. They're all sort of systemically mixed up. And again, one point that Panich and Gindin stress in their book, to make it even maybe a little more complicated, but I think a little more helpful, is that again, America has enemies in the world. It has opponents in the world. It doesn't have enemies in a very real way. There's no government and certainly no military that really challenges America. America dominates the global economy in a way that no country in history has ever dominated it, and to a great extent, even the most powerful countries, China included, consent to that in terms of how the global monetary system works, how the global trade system works, how the global productivity system works. There's squabbles within that, and these wars are about those squabbles, and they're also about keeping people in our own country distracted from what the real issues are and who the real enemies are, in relation to our own government, meaning the primary enemy is us. But which was actually the original conclusion of that article, which ended up getting changed, but for brevity purposes. But in any event, this global system, again, it's tight and it's evolved and it's been going on. It goes back to World War II and the way in which the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank operate, the way NATO has operated since then, the way that UN to a certain extent has operated since then. And after the fall of the Cold War, the entire globe was incorporated into this system. And again, it's not gonna be changed radically from being challenged by China. That's not going to happen, or or Russia, whatever is going on in Ukraine.
Or the
These
BRICS.
or the BRICS. I mean, there is a system there, and they're all part of that system. Elites in those countries are part of that system. The genius of this neoliberal system, according to Panich and Gindin, is the manner in which these financial systems and these corporate systems have incorporated elites of all of these countries into basically maintaining their own power by conforming to U.S. interests in the way the entire system works. So we're talking about something very, very difficult here. And I think the strategic point I want to make before I forget to make it is that when we talk about as Noam Chomsky talks about the imminent crisis of nuclear war and climate change,
right.
I think again, we have to draw back from those, as urgent and scary as they are. We have to draw back from those and say there's political solutions. It's the economic system that is hurtling us towards those crises. The economic system has to be challenged, and it has to be challenged in a very thoughtful political way. We really can't, I mean, as much as we want to go after global warming at a kind of technical level, or even a kind of movement level, it's not going to work if the economic system doesn't change in all the ways that I've been alluding to during this program.
If I disagreed with you at all, David, it would be about the success, if you like, of that economic system.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take the view from 1945 to the present, that is from the end of the Second World War to now, it's clear that that the immense amount of effort and the millions of people killed by the U.S. to maintain the system that existed, to maintain the system that you describe, it actually has suffered a certain diminution in those years, not so much because U.S. power has not been vigorously exercised, look at all the dead people, as I say, but because the rest of the world did recover in some ways from the crises of the Great Depression and the Second World War. And as they recovered, and I include China in this notably because that certainly was a recovery as well, the sort of overall share that the U.S. controlled of the world economy was necessarily diminished. Now, that didn't mean that the U.S. wasn't vigorously making sure that its writ ran everywhere. That's what everything from Vietnam to Ukraine is about. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S. does have some rivals, economic rivals in the world, and the most notable example from the morning's headlines is probably the fact that the attempt by the Clinton administration to turn Russia into a third world country after the fall of the Soviet Union was in fact unsuccessful, and that Russia today, in its present political configuration, produces severe political problems for the United States, so that we have traditional foreign policy spokesman in the U.S. talking about a new Cold War. Well, that needs to be translated. What is a new Cold War? The new Cold War is that Russia is not as supine in relationship to American policies, mainly economic control, as the Russia of Yeltsin was, and that makes the lights burn late and foggy bottom. The U.S. is concerned about it, and the U.S. does such unconscionable things as promote a revolution in Ukraine and encourage the killing of people in Ukraine so that its writ runs there. And that's, I mean, when we look at the morning headlines, what we look at is a situation that is a result of the U.S. attempting to maintain that position of dominance, that position of disparity that existed 2 generations ago.
Yeah, no, I mean, it raises, Russia is certainly the most interesting and challenging example of a country that in some way threatens American global hegemony in some way or other. And that certainly, I mean, it isn't included from the possibility of the, what Panich and Gindin talk about in the making of global capitalism, that there will be challenges to that. But their book is about the the enormous sort of technical and management skills that it has taken to make sure that these things don't happen or that they are managed when they do happen. It doesn't mean that there aren't failures. It doesn't mean that a lot of that there are wars that are called failures. We talked last week about whether these really, wars like Iraq and Vietnam really should be called failures or not.
Failures
in
from the
terms
point of view of American government.
American foreign policy, and even whether what's happening in Russia can possibly be talked about as challenging the manner in which the 1% joining with elites of European countries and Japan and increasingly China dominate the global economy. Russia is feisty, and it's an interesting prospect. It's more interesting in some ways. I mean, I think the American global hegemony has been more clearly challenged in Latin America,
yes.
Venezuela, and so
yes.
forth. But in some ways, in not as interesting a ways as it's being challenged by China, because
not on the same scale.
Yeah, not on the same scale. Due to this Putin character who has a mind of his own, and I mean, I'm no authority on what goes on in Putin's head, or I don't know if anyone is, but. Again, it's not what you're being told in the newspapers.
Exactly.
I mean, all
exactly.
Just to get back to the idea that you pick up the morning newspaper and you read about Israel. You read the article on page 3 or 5 or whatever it is about Israel and what's going on there, the
right.
AP article, and next to it is an article about how the guy who started an Elvis museum died.
You're not making this up, I know, because I saw the same page.
It's just
right.
The Elvis Museum guy got, and there's a picture of the Elvis Museum guy where there's no picture of children getting killed in Gaza. So it's like, I mean, people have to get out of this strange, this absurd, when you enter into the newspaper. I mean, I realize people, especially watching this show, do a lot more than read that. But when you think about people who live in that world, it's a little scary to think about how you begin to talk to people and question the assumptions that people are going to get if they trust what the editors of the News Gazette have to offer them.
Well, and that's, I mean, Noam Chomsky years ago gave a little talk about the problem of American media being a problem of concision. Mm-hmm. He says you've got to say everything between 2 commercials or in one column on the side of the newspaper. Yeah. So he says if you can do that, then you're talking this conventional language that we've been speaking of. You don't say anything new, anything different. For example, if you say, yes, America in the 60s, there was upset about the Vietnam War, but thank goodness that's all gone away. Mm-hmm. Everyone says, fine, of course, all that excess of the 60s, if you want to see an example of this, read Barack Obama's book, that is his audition piece for the presidency, I never can get the title right because I always say mendacity. It's the audacity of hope, right? And in that, he takes that dismissive idea of all those excesses of the 60s, which thankfully we've overcome. Well, if you don't begin with the understanding that the U.S. won the war in Vietnam, you don't understand very well what is happening in the world polity and economy over the last 2 generations. But if you make that point, if you say that in a newspaper article or on a program like this, you got to be able to give your reasons. You got to be able to say why. People haven't heard that. What do you mean we won the Vietnam War? The U.S. lost the Vietnam War. That was embarrassing, wasn't it? And of course that's because all those people that we were helping we couldn't count on. Same thing's happening in Iraq. We couldn't count on those people that it's probably a racial thing, but still and all that. That's the sort of discussion that has to go on, and it simply doesn't. Our task here and other places around the world is to make that discussion occur.
I hope so. My favorite little piece of trivia, annoying trivial newspaper, but sort of trying to demonstrate this point at a much smaller level. There was an editorial the News Gazette writers had a few days ago about local basketball program and basketball coach and how much he's being paid.
Oh, yes.
And after railing against the amount of money in sports and corruption and all this kind of stuff, they basically end up concluding that the fact that the basketball coach at the U of I gets paid $1 million a year is a simple matter of supply and demand.
Right.
And okay, so I know it's a trivial example, but it's a teachable moment. What does supply and demand mean in terms of what a basketball coach these days is getting paid? Who's the supply? Who's the demand? What's the demand from? What's the demand for? Who determines how much money goes into this system? How all that gets paid for, and how it is that coaches, who decides what this group of elite coaches who allegedly can bring winning basketball to the U of I after all these losing years, what is it that they're actually worth? And I think if people just begin to ask a question of how the system works, about how money gets funneled into the college, the intercollegiate athletic system, the NCAA, through the cable companies and ESPN and the cable stations and so forth, and then ask where these coaches come from and what they actually accomplish in terms of how much they get paid, people can begin to kind of puncture this notion that somehow our economy works on the basis of these markets where people make rational choices. Who's making these choices? Who's making these choices with whose money?
Well, look, David, we have here a program for university reform right ahead of us. The task is to make a university that the sports teams can be proud of. And if we can't do that, we're obviously not in the right business. It's quite incredible.
If you were talking about Ohio State, I mean, that might be true, but anyway, I don't want to get into that. But I mean, it's just remarkable the things that people believe, that the way supply and demand actually works, that this is what's really going on here, and I would challenge our audience to say, how would you think about the way that system? How did that arise? Just didn't. The fact that college basketball coaches get paid $1 million, it's just assumed they get paid that much even if they lose. How did that happen? How did that system change during this neoliberal era in the last 40 years? You can see that as a microcosm: the rise of cable, the rise of ESPN, monopolistic practices in regard to those things, advertising, the whole thing, and the way higher ed evolved in those ways from a vibrant political culture to a culture in which people are expected to go to the game and root for their teams. So this is part of the era that we're talking about here.
And the key question to be asked in many of these cases, from the Illinois basketball team to the dead children on the beach in Gaza, is cui bono. Mm-hmm. Who profits, literally? Mm-hmm. Whose interests are being served by this operation? Ignore the propaganda which the American society is best at of any society in history. Ignore the propaganda and ask yourself whose purposes are being served. Whose interests is this activity? In whose interest is this activity? That's the question that will lead on to recognizing the neoliberal triumph of the last generation and breaking through the carapace of that surrounds the American economy, American economic policy, and American military policy. It's a task that has to be done, and if we can help you do it, then our job is done. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 29th week of 2014. This has, unfortunately, been another child killer edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussion tonight has been David Green, and do see his article in last Sunday's News Gazette. We will post it to the News from Neptune Facebook page if we haven't already done so. I think it may be there if you go looking for it.
It's on the News Gazette website as well.
And that's
under opinion commentary.
I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and do see that Facebook page as well. I am happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Dan. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.